Zootopia 2, this long-awaited sequel that took 9 years in the making, which leads to the testament on how well are they gonna write this sequel, since many of them lately have just been hit or miss. So this review of this sequel will lead to whether or not Disney finally cooked with a sequel again. What's up, everybody? This is Willie, and in this video I'm reviewing Zootopia 2, the long-awaited sequel that had been anticipated for years, and I recently just finally watched it. And this leaves me with the bigger question of, did I like it or not? Which, to get to all of that, I'm going to make my review on the good and bad things with this movie to help ground on where my thoughts are leaning with this movie. Now I have this long-awaited sequel that I'm sure a huge amount of the Disney fanbase were grueling for. We're same here because we definitely can't get enough of Judy and Nick. However, with Disney's recent track record of modern movies not being the greatest in the world, whether they be just nonsensical live action remakes, which I don't care, or just sequels that exist just for being a sequel that absolutely has no charm coming out of it. And this is what stems from my huge preference for DreamWorks in their animations, because they know how to go deep and inspire a new sense of gem, which Disney is struggling to follow. And furthermore, with now glitch animation becoming what Disney is failing at, it's left me in a world where I'd rather enjoy myself in a virtual circus world with a wannabe Bonnie-esque figure singing Daisy Bell. Daisy, Daisy. But now the city of Zootopia has been calling me to visit their environment once again, so I think it's about time that I finally left the circus tent and re-immerse myself into the Disney world. So to put it this way, taking us back all the way to the first film, I was just a big sucker for it, and I always thought it was one of the greatest gems that Disney could ever make, feeling super inspiring but also blended in with its comical qualities and very complex main characters. And I know we had other media like Zootopia Plus, which unfortunately I never personally watched it, but I have seen clips, so it was enough for me to grasp on. So now to talk properly about the Zootopia 2 sequel, how well does it hold up? Well, dare I say it, Disney finally again was cooking, basically reheating Inside Out 2's nachos, but adding on that needed sprinkle to convey that charm in its flow. But to give a more deeper illustration, the movie has a more heavy-handed focus on Judy and Nick's dynamic, portraying them to be this very dysfunctional pairing with only 1 week in, which I should mention that this movie about 1 week after the events of the first film, and I did enjoy how this movie does subtly touch on that, though I'm glad they don't oversaturate too much with that concept. But anyways, this whole central plot surrounding the two, blended with its very action-filled plot combined with some wacky comedy, and it was just very well executed, that made the investment into this movie on a wide peak. And what I like about this movie is how much they are honing in on the strengths of this dynamic that is also combined with their journey that centers in on the themes of exploitation and restorative justice. And watching these two having to maneuver around every sort of obstacle to find closure to this case is vastly intriguing, but that's also what leads to the theme of this movie being very interesting to introduce to children, as although the message is not blatantly told, it is presented in a very exhilarating way where we're understanding a lot of the intricacies surrounding this theme. And to obviously emphasize how it was factored into the plot, this whole storyline stems from a reptile snake named Gary barging his way to try and retrieve that climate wall journal that was possessed by the Lynx Cleats, during which as Judy and Nick start to learn more about Gary's motives in using that journal as his key to give his family the justice, it quickly gives them the change of heart that leads to them assisting with him to follow his goals, though he's not with them for a lot of the beginning portions of this journey, as this is where the Judy and Nick become fugitives for what they did. So now their own fellow cops are on hot pursuit of them, so it leads to the next sequence just involving the pair essentially trying to hide out from them, and they eventually make their way to a marsh market with the help of Nibbles the Beaver, who I'm going to talk about highly soon, as I really appreciate every ounce of her on screen. And before I continue on the story, I want to continue taking a moment to appreciate how wonderful the animation is with executing this sophisticated aesthetic, with how well detailed it is visually, not just aesthetically but also complexity too, which brings me back to the first film and how its luxury was always pertained to this brilliant animation, and it's what adds to this tinge to the film, which has gladly been transferred to this one. And so afterwards, the two escape Marsh Market as the cops are pursuing them again, and this is where we get to the film's major act, as we are at the top of an abandoned shack that later tears apart and also as metaphorically splits Judy and Nick apart for some time in this film. And also prior to this, we started to see a rift in their dynamic, with Judy being being so hellbent on fighting basically tooth and nail just to help reach Gary's justice, but Nick doesn't really pander to that, as he's not feeling the desire to put his life at risk just to basically become the hero in this case, which those words he says would end up being subtle foreshadowing to what would nearly happen to Judy later on in the film. But it is really interesting how this part does start to indulge on the differences between Judy and Nick, and that they are faced with challenges between their contrasting personalities and how their traits are not really gelling together, which does fundamentally highlight the complexities surrounding their dynamic, and the film essentially siding with the notion of them being a dysfunctional pairing. But this also brings to a very interesting line from Judy mentioning about agree to disagree, which I think further reflects on the broader scope of their relationship, but also becomes a strong phrase that Nick would end up utilizing later on in the film, which I think would also reflect on the strengths of their dynamic, where despite their differences, their exchanges do mean a lot to one another, and it's what vastly maintains their connection that devoids them from the desire of splitting, which tragically to that storyline, that's where we would end up when they get separated, with Judy eventually falling in the hands of Gary, who's with an anonymous partner who rescued him, while sadly for Nick, he would get caught by the ZPD and would be imprisoned, with the head Linksley, who is named Milton by the way, now plans to expand the snow tundra that will affect the Marsh Market zone, though that adds to a new conflicting threat in this film, which by the end of it doesn't really amount to much, but it does further emphasize on the menace of the Linksleys, outside of one who I will now emphasize that Paw Bird, one of the Linksleys that Judy met earlier, has somewhat befriended Gary, is now partnered up with him to help him with his case. And the portrayal of Paw Bird being an outcast of his family made things interesting to see where his role would be in this part of the storyline, and with Judy's involvement, this new trio would be able to find some deep information regarding some history that basically involves an important patent that was a proxy of Gary's great-grandmother, who created this patent and wall journal that would represent the equality of Zootopia's district. And it would also finally explain the exploitation where she worked with a Linksley to make the funds of this project, and he would rip out her signature and forge it as his own, and top of that, frame her for a horrible act he did, which would end up getting her locked up and shafting every one of the snake population from Zootopia, which would lead to their respective town being buried in snow over the years. And this whole revelation is insane, but also does further villainize the Linksleys. And seeing a brave snake like Gary now finally taking his chance to essentially pull off this heist to find a source that will stand his ground for his population. And in speaking of, the patent is that source, which Gary's great-grandma was able to hide somewhere before her eventual arrest, and now that search for the patent becomes the integral storyline for the back third of this movie. But to take a moment, I love how the writing for this movie doesn't double down from its previous and actually tries to rectify some of its mistakes, more particularly on the background regarding our villains, where there's a lot more grounds to understand their goals, which I can't say the same for Bellwether, as her portrayal was not great. But also what I like here is the menacing portrayal they've been getting, and that stays consistent with the authenticity of their traits. But this movie film would have a lot more up its sleeve as we move along. So then we have Nick actually in prison, but he's able to break out with the help of Nibbles, who I'm glad to see on screen again, and she helps him escape prison, which unfortunately he activates the wrong button that allows every other prisoner to escape, as well as Bellwether, which we have a fun cameo of. But then Nick gets the help of our good old slow friend Flash, who we know from the end of the first film operates his vehicle in such a flash, so that will help him get back with Judy. And also seeing Clawhauser being assistive to them was something interesting to see, that we still have some of our reoccurring characters, though a bit sidelined, still actively supporting Judy and Nick despite being fugitives. So then with that trio, which they finally were able to activate the clock tower's light that will illuminate the location of the reptile district, this is where we get the big moment of Paw Bird's betrayal, which I will get to more emphasis on later on in the video, but I can tell this was shocking to a lot of viewers. Now, I tend to know that fans dislike the aspect of twist villains, but I think this one was done effectively for a time needed, and his role was executed perfectly, where he stays in line with his family's name despite his conflicts with them, and is also strengthened by his line of refusing to be different, even though he had this chance with his time with Judy and Gary, but he completely throws all of that away and tries to essentially end them so he can report back to his family about the patent's location so they can tarnish it, which essentially adds to the ruthless qualities in them. And also I've seen how it really divides a lot of the reception surrounding Paw Bird now that he's more of a polarizing figure. But then with Nick and Nibbles finding their way to reunite with Judy, and having Nick fending off Paw Bird to save his partner's life, which he succeeds in, and she does the same for him. This leads us to a very heartfelt interaction between the two, which just gives way into romantic implications, and I'm definitely sure this was a great appeal to a lot of fans who were hoping for this kind of connection. And yeah, to brush that aside, I'm fond for this deep moment where they really express their cares for one another, and also seeing how Nick was able to utilize Judy's phrasing of agree to disagree when Paw Bird tried to use his own words against him. It was a great reflection on the significance with Nick's bond with Judy. And thus, this is where we finally get to the final showdown, where the Linkslings finally get their downfall, as well as Paw Bird, who at first was finally finding his validation within his family, just for for all of that to crumble all around him within the next few sequences. And with now Gary finally being able to retrieve his great-grandmother's patent, he would finally find closure to his mission that would essentially now allow the justification for his population to return to Zootopia. And it is such a satisfying ending when seeing Gary finally reunite with his family, and now the Linksleys being locked up for their crimes, and overall satisfies this very tangible story plot, has now made me feel a bit better with Disney. And yeah, like I mentioned, Disney really was acing it with this film after a streak of films that were failing to reach that upper echelon. And this sequel may be the start of Disney finally getting better again with this film. And while we'll have to wait and see with later films down the road, this amazing sequel was a strong sign of Disney's future trajectory. And also seeing that this film is blowing away in the box office, the compromise is there to build some sort of faith in Disney once again. So I pretty much said most of my piece on my likings with this film, but there's still some things that I want to elaborate on. Whereas brilliant of a film it is, it manages to make that hit just like the first film, and it is stemming from the journey of Judy and Nick that exuded this very engaging journey that also is supplied with its heartfelt and emotional atmosphere with a very captivating story that dwells in on a mystery that speaks a very compelling message for kids to understand. Yes, there could have been more done for this film with what it's got, but I think it plays off its tropes really well and gives its sense of comedy a good enough standards that I hope sets a good precedent for Disney in its long run. Plus, I also find the new featured character to be somewhat compelling and also enjoyable. Like, the Linksleys as villainous figures are interesting enough. And hey, you know, we're in a world where in 2025, we have animated films where the felines are the major antagonists. Anyways, we got Gary, who served his purpose for the plot, and his mission was very captivating. There's Brian Windancer, who I failed to mention throughout the review, but he has an interesting portrayal on the movie, as he was a character who would end up working with the Linksleys, which as a mayor, it felt like Zootopia was just doomed to have a good mayor, but nope, he subverted all of that as he proven himself that he was never any sort of antagonist and that he was just in a naive spot because of this deception that the Linksleys had, which by the end of it, I like how the film subverted from the stereotypical evil mayor storyline that they implanted twice in the first film. Appreciated to see Zootopia finally have a mayor who's sane. And finally, let's talk about Nibbles Maple Stick, which, dare I say, I might be among one of the #1 Nibbles Maple Sticks fan. Like, I can't get enough of her, and becoming a gem in this movie. Even though times she felt like a bit of a plot device, she still brought a fun, witty energy, and even those part where she and Nick were imprisoned, her interaction with him was pretty fun. And I do like how she's being shown when necessary, not like situations where it would be nonsensical and a bit distracting from the pacing, and I do think Nibbles was ripe to appear every moment because she was important to that part. And though I wish we got a lot more with her because she's mother, I don't think many other scenes she would have any sort of merit to it. Like, what is there much more that she can have in the other scenes in this movie? Though with some word about a third movie, I hope she gets much more to glow in that one, in hopes that she actually has much of a bigger role in that movie. So please, Disney, give me an appeal for a prophecy I'm making here. But then this movie delivers up some of its strongest humor, some good slapsticks, and most of that comes from Nick because he is a treasure when his snarkiness brings the pure comedy. And although short, it was nice enough to get some cameos of some significant characters from the first film, like Clawhauser, Gazelle, and say, I'll also give some highlight to Chief Bogo. And to really talk about Chief Bogo here, where I like how he was a lot more affable in this film, which pertained to that very cordial discussion he had with Judy, expressing his liking for her, which I do find it to be a blessing after his contradictory towards her in the first film. And with that, it also leads to him essentially being written out of the film after he gets bit by Gary's venom. And truthfully, I do feel like it was done so he wouldn't have any sort of affiliation with the fugitive plot, because then that would essentially tank a lot of his capacity with softening up to Judy. And honestly, the props always will go to Idris Elba for his delivery because it's a flawless performance. Like Knuckles, he can be tough, but he does have it built in him to soften up. Now, truth be told, twist villains, especially from Disney's side of things, aren't really revered because either they were not written efficiently as possible to make sense of their motivations, or they just completely come off nonsensical with absolutely no grounds to it, and that's exactly the fatal error with Bellwether's portrayal in the last movie. So in this movie with Pawbird, I think for once in a while, Disney actually cooked this one, as everything with his motives absolutely sells us what a villainous figure would desire, and of how consistent he is with his sentiment of being a Linksley, which is inheriting this vile and sophisticated persona. And once his betrayal finally takes place, it really unravels everything, with him staying loyal to the family name while also being effective with this deception to finally make a name for himself in his family, as he was always the one mistreated. So he had that common goal to stay within the family's tradition while also developing a validation with his shtick. And I think this twist really makes it great with his writing too, as it kind of subverted our expectations that he was just going to deprive himself from his family orientation and try to be different from them. But he completely turned that all around at the end, which honestly leads to his now villainous side being a lot more cartoonish in a lot of ways. But generally, this whole writing with Poppert was executed brilliantly, with it being a somewhat palpable figure with his position within his family dynamics, and everything that he done was his goal to prove himself worthy to his criminal-minded family, which I think is a very unique shift in a villain sort of role, where he's not really motivated by grief or anything. It was an act of desperation for approval from his family, and he was somewhat succeeding that, as we saw his interaction with Milton later on, but everything goes off the rails for them afterwards. But yeah, the complexity surrounding Poppert is effectively written, and obviously after what he did in trying to end Judy and Gary, there's absolutely no redeeming qualities from him afterwards. But hey, it's a glaring sort of concept to add to the consistency with his character. But the movie does still come with its downsides. Like, it's not perfect in any ways, and I do feel like, if you notice, the pacing felt rushed. Like, I'm pleased to have very action-filled sequences where there's not really much nonsensical filler, but I feel like the moment for the viewers to breathe was not really all there until the moment Judy is introduced to Poppert and Gary's partnership. Like, I can understand because of the shorter runtime, but the rushiness of it just kind of felt off-putting with the pacing. And then nothing against Judy and Nick's dynamic, because their pairing always is what engages me with the films, but I do not like how exploitative their conflict with one another was, which is funny how that's in line with the movie's theme. But at points, their constant bickering comes off a bit contrived and shoehorned just for the sake of adding this inner team drama that at most times doesn't really provide its weight to it. And then to talk briefly about Gary, which the amount of times that they were marketing him gave me the impression that he was going to have such a elongated role in this movie, but the film itself left me a bit perplexed with how short-handed his role was. Not saying that he did not get much, because he did eventually come into the picture near the back third of the movie, but that's exactly what I'm saying. It's in the back third that his role skyrockets, as even a featured character like him had a somewhat subdued screen time, despite clearly his role being extremely important to the plot of seeking the rightful justice. Don't get me wrong, I'm so blessed with what he brought to the story, but I wish he was a lot more central than what he was marketed to be. Like, overall, despite some of those flawed elements in writing that unfortunately takes away some of its charm, I still feel like the movie became a sort of a fresh of breath air for a Disney film. With that, I think this wraps it up for me, and comment down below what you think of this movie, whether you liked it or not. Tap that like and subscribe, and likewise, I appreciate you all tuning in.